coding interviews, STEM shortage claims, and finding a job. This video is intended for people who have been recently checking out some of my old videos on STEM shortage claims. I don't know for sure why people are doing this, but I rather suspect it's the many layoffs that have been announced by major high technology employers such as Google, Apple, and many others in the last few months. It is currently February of 2024. So I'm going to focus on things that I might think would be helpful to people who might be worried about losing their job or finding another job in what is probably going to be a difficult environment. And I'm going to talk specifically about grueling code interviews and why you, in looking for a job, might want to avoid a particular type of these interviews, which is the most common type of interview. But before I get going, let me define a couple of terms that I just used. First of all, what are coding interviews? The last 10, 15 years or so in the Silicon Valley, and I'm located in Mountain View where Google is located. So I'm going to speak mostly about my experience in this area, although I believe many of these customs are all over the world now and are not specific to where I live. But I can speak with the greatest expertise and personal experience for the Silicon Valley, where Google is located, where Apple is located, where Facebook is located, and many, many other companies and high-tech employers. So coding interviews are really come in two types. The one I'm going to speak about is interviews about sort of computer science 101, maybe 201, the kind of things that are taught or used to be taught in computer science courses in college. So these are things like algorithms and programs to search for words, sort category, sort, for example, lists, to implement hash tables. There's a wide range of these. And it's become extremely common that most of your interview to get a job actually is a coding interview, where you spend hours, sometimes at a whiteboard, basically solving these problems and going through stuff that a computer science student, at least when I was a kid, young person, a computer science student would have learned in college or university. Kind of basic stuff that was all worked out back in the 1960s and maybe 70s and is, quote, basic computer science. That's a coding interview. Now, there are other coding interviews where you're actually being asked about things you actually would work on at the job. When I interviewed at Apple, I worked on their touch technology for the iPhones and iPads and what have you. They were actually asked coding questions specifically related to the algorithms they actually used, which are not these things which are taught in school. They're not basic subjects like sorting, searching, AP computer science course questions, things of that nature. No, they actually ask about things that were related to what they were actually doing. Now, I'm not going to talk about those coding interviews. The thing that is pervasive in the Silicon Valley is actually to ask questions about, like, well, how would you implement a hash table and do it this way? I tormented people looking for a job with this question, for example. And it's good to know this stuff. However, you don't use it in your job. And in fact, even if you learned it in school, you're probably rusty after many years of experience. You just don't do this stuff. It's all already built into the programming languages and tools. So you don't actually study this. You don't actually practice this in the real world anymore, with rare exceptions. Some people really do, because that's the type of algorithms and software they develop. But that's a tiny number of people. Now, I'm not going to discuss in this video how you take these coding interviews or practice or any of that. There are many books, many excellent books available, like Gail Luckman McDowell's series, The Cracking the Coding Interview. She's done a whole bunch of others. There are dozens of others who produce books. You can get tutorials on YouTube. You can go pay money for crash courses in how to do these coding interviews. I'm not going to get into any of that. There's plenty of materials on that. I'm going to talk a little bit about how these conflict with some of the claims of STEM shortages. I'll say what STEM shortages are in a moment, and what's odd and contradictory about this practice, and why, and I'm going to discuss why you might, as an experienced programmer who's been in the industry for a while and to your surprise been laid off or threatened with layoffs, you might want to just boycott these interviews. So I'll explain that, why you should consider that possibility. I'm not saying you should do it, I'm saying you should think about it when you think about why these coding interviews are so pervasive in the computer industry today. And they are a new phenomenon. You didn't really see this in the 1990s or early 00s. It developed maybe 10, 15 years ago. Okay, so that's coding interviews. And I'm going to talk specifically about coding interviews. STEM shortage claims are pervasive claims that date back at least to the 1950s of terrible shortages of scientists, technologists, engineers, mathematicians, hence STEM. S for science, T for technology, E for engineering, and M for math. These aren't new claims. I've done a whole bunch of videos, which you may have watched, about why they're false, why they are done, really debunking them. That's nothing new. They've been debunked for years. The reality is that the U.S. produces a lot of people, huge number of people take AP, or AB, and BC calculus, for example. Several 100,000 per year, and the number has been going up around 6 to 7%, well ahead of the population growth rate every year since the 1970s. We produce a lot of nerds, a lot of people who are into computers and programming and so on. There really isn't a shortage, and certainly not the kind of severe shortage that is often claimed. If you're worried about your job, or you've already lost your job and you were working for some company like Google, for example, or Apple, or many of these other companies, you may be very surprised, right? They're profitable. They've been profitable for a long time, or so they say, and yet they got rid of you, and you're experienced, and maybe you're really wondering because, well, you're a very experienced person, there's nothing wrong with you, and all of a sudden they don't want to employ you. Waves of layoffs like this have a long, long history in the computer industry. Many long-lived companies like Texas Instruments, which is in Texas mostly, are notorious for waves of these layoffs of experienced, capable engineers and technologists, maybe every few years. So I'm going to talk about how these things relate and some of the contradictions between this practice of these coding interviews on basic computer science questions and the explanations for the STEM shortage related practices and claims. That's a little wordy, but let's go forward. All right. So first of all, what's strange about these and particularly conflicts with the STEM shortage claims is indeed that you're being asked to interview about basic computer science things which actually are not used in everyday programming in the vast majority of jobs, including people like myself that work in advanced algorithms or video compression or many of these other fields. AI, of course, is the big buzzword right now, but in fact, these things are rarely used in these areas. They were solved problems a long time ago, and they're now built into virtually every programming language and tool, whether you're using C or C++, they're not built into the language. There's a library you can get. You don't need to worry about these things anymore. And yet, not just people who come right out of school, but also highly experienced software developers and others are put through grueling interviews that last hours asking about this kind of material, these kind of questions, which they've never used since they graduated, unless, of course, they had another coding interview. Right? You actually don't use these things. And it's worth remembering, from time to time, people will pipe up and say, well, I have a lot of experience, and this employer or that employer that's complaining about the STEM shortage and they can't find anybody, why aren't they hiring me? If you're worried about your job or you've already lost your job, you may actually be in the position of saying, I am an expert. Why did they get rid of me? They're making money. Suddenly they're getting rid of me. That doesn't make any sense. They say it's really hard to find people like me, right? That's what they say. And they will say, what we were looking for is specific experience. Just because you went to MIT and you have an IQ of 180 or something like that, and you have all this, quote, experience, you work for these other companies, or you scored perfectly on the SAT or the GRE, any of these kind of things, they'll say, well, the problem is we have to have people with experience in the very latest version of some tool. And usually it's like 20 tools, every one. So like I've done Python programming for years, but Python is now Python 3.11. And I do use it, But the thing is, you could say, well, you have 5 years, 10 years, 20 years of experience with Python. But it's not with 3.11, it's with 3.2 or 2.9. So you don't know anything. And this is the kind of excuse they give. They say, we really have to have these super specialists, these purple squirrels, who are really expert in a very specific, very narrow thing. They're up on the latest stuff. Well, obviously, if you're one of those people and you're getting laid off, or you fear you're going to be laid off, you got to wonder about that. But here's the thing. If that's what you really want, if that's what the shortage is, the super specialists, the people who are just really up on some hot new technology and have to know, Python 3.2 doesn't cut it. They got to know the latest thing. Not only why would you lay those people off, which is actually what happens, but why would you have all of your interview focused on things that have nothing to do with these hot new technologies? Something from 1965 that was figured out that was actually the hot new technology over probably 60 years ago in many cases. Really basic stuff that you never actually use, or you very rarely actually use. Now, I know that some coding interviews, such as the one I had at Apple, for example, that's not what they were doing. But these coding interviews, where it's really basically these basic skills, basic knowledge, that very few people, including people who do very deep programming, ever use. You'd think the coding interviews would be about Python 3.11. Now, they are sometimes, but often they're about these basic skills. They seem structured to hire whom? People right out of school who work hard, have the time and the interest and the enthusiasm and the energy, motivation to spend a lot of time studying these basic things. Of course, it also means that people who take courses or do tutorials or get Gail Luckman McDowell's book and have the time and focus to learn something that, if they're highly experienced, they aren't using. Right? They have to learn this stuff because, well, that's how you get the job. So it heavily skews towards people, to newbies, actually. People who have very little or no experience. That's actually what the coding interviews do. Now, it's a way that you could hire somebody who's 22, say they're experienced because, well, yeah, they know these computer science skills that are taught in school that actual programmers with years of experience rarely or if ever use. That's what they seem to be doing. It also, to some degree, allows you to claim that there's a terrible shortage because, indeed, most programmers don't actually know this stuff that well. Even if they really were good at it in school, in college, 10, 20 years ago, whatever, unless they've been keeping up on it, they just don't use it that much, so they're rusty. And they're competing with people right out of school, and they're competing with people who have the time, think no kids, limited personal commitments, they don't have kids, they're not as old, they have the time to sit there and go through Gail Luckman McDowell's book or other, tutorials, take a crash course, all that kind of stuff. Now, there'll be some older people that can do that. Maybe their kids have left, they never had kids, that kind of thing, right? But it screens out a lot of experienced people. We're not just talking about like some guy who's 65 or something, or 85. We're not just talking about older people that you would think of as age discrimination. This affects you, much earlier. Now, if you're worried about your job or you are actually been laid off in the current waves, there's a good chance you fall into certain categories. Now, it's true all kinds of people get laid off. But often, who is getting nailed by these layoffs? It tends to be people with more than 7 years of paid professional experience as like a programmer or an engineer or a scientist or something like that. And I'm talking about actually doing the technical work. I'm not talking about managers. I'm not talking about professors who write grants or any of this kind of stuff. The people that get laid off are usually younger, and they're the people actually doing the work. And when they get to somewhere in the range of 7 to sometimes 10 years of technical experience, often they're laid off, even though they know a ton of stuff. By that time, you have 7, 10 years of programming experience. Unless you work in certain specialized sub-areas, you probably have forgot a lot of that stuff about, search algorithms or trees and hash tables. It's all stuff that's already solved that you're reusing from your programming language or a library that comes with your product, or your programming tool. Now, for middle managers, I'm going to focus on technical people because that's what I am, not the middle managers, mid-level managers. Mid-level managers often have a technical background, and they can last a little bit longer before they're suddenly find themselves being laid off. So maybe it's more like 10 to 15, maybe even sometimes 20 years of experience. But then very often they turn up in these waves of layoffs. People who hold PhDs, I have a PhD, seem to get pushed out and have harder times finding jobs. People who have no college experience at all. They've all self-taught. They started programming, who knows, some job they had out of high school, or maybe they even dropped out of high school in some cases. Some famous examples of people, like the founders of WhatsApp, I believe, didn't have a college education. And that is one of the groups that tends to get shoved out and have trouble finding jobs, even though they may have years of clear experience, a real track record, and so on. Nonetheless, yeah, no, all right. If you're in a, quote, underrepresented minority, you are likely to maybe fall prey to this. Now, what is an underrepresented minority? There's lots of minorities in the Silicon Valley. There's, obviously people from India, South Asia, Chinese, all sorts of other countries and other places are obviously minorities, and actually they're quite small minorities in the United States, but that's not really who gets targeted. Companies stay away from certain groups. They stay away from, I would say they stay away from African Americans who are not immigrants or the children of immigrants. So in other words, if people can kind of trace their ancestry back to people who were slaves at some point back in the 1800s or 1700s. Now, there are such people working in high tech, of course. There are exceptions to all of these things. But that seems to be the group in particular. Now, if you're from some elite group in Central Africa, maybe that doesn't really seem to apply. So you have African Americans, you have Hispanics who have visible American Indian ancestry. Okay, Hispanic is a cultural category, it's not a racial category, and includes people who are totally Spanish or Portuguese or whatever, and they actually don't have any, and certainly not any visible American Indian ancestry. And there are lots of those folks in high tech. In fact, they probably make up most of the Hispanics that companies like Google and Apple report employing as engineers. They typically throw out about 4% of their employees in some of these reports they claim are Hispanic. Of course, they're in California, where probably half the people in California are Hispanics, okay, are Mexican Americans and sometimes from other countries, Central America. But here's the gotcha. Only about maybe 20%, from what I've seen, of Hispanics living in California are basically European in appearance, right? They don't have any, they may have American Indian ancestors, of course. In fact, it's likely. But they don't have visible American Indian ancestry. So you have all these groups, and you might be in one of them if you're worried, that are sort of somehow particularly prone to getting laid off. They have trouble getting jobs, even if they're highly qualified. There's this funny something going on. Another group that seems to fall into that category are people from India who are not in the high-ranking caste, the Brahmins and these other groups. People who are from like the supposed untouchables or the Dalits. They seem to run into these problems too. Now, I have theories about why this is done. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on those right now, but what I want to say is what is going on with these coding interviews where you're being asked grueling, this can take hours, it can be very stressful, and so on. What is going on is not clear, but it doesn't make a lot of sense, especially in the context of some other things that are said in the context of STEM shortage claims. If what's really going on is these companies, their shortage is of these super specialists, the purple squirrels that have 20 of these tools that they've been using for years, getting paid professionally to do, and they're up on the latest tool, right? You can't just have Python, you got to have Python 3.1 or Xcode, whatever the latest version is, C++, 2020, whatever. If that's what they're really concerned about, and that is frequently the way that they will explain why they are not hiring people who seem otherwise remarkably well qualified. Lots of highly qualified people interview at Google. I've interviewed at Google. Friends of mine have interviewed at Google, and they don't get a job offer, even though Google is desperate. There's a shortage. Same way with Apple, same way with many of these companies. Now, I'm not going to talk here about the 10x explanation that there are these mutant supermen out there who can program 10 times better than the typical MIT, Caltech, or Carnegie Mellon graduate that doesn't get a job offer from these big companies. I'm just going to leave that out of this presentation and just focus on the super specialists, the purple squirrels. Well, clearly, the purple squirrel explanation does not fit with a company which is interviewing with these coding interviews, which are about these basic skills, the kinds of thing, or I wouldn't even say basic skills, these basic knowledge that is no longer widely used in programming. It's buried in the, it's like, learning how to make fire, right? Nobody today makes fire, right? You don't make fire. You go get a match and you use a match to make fire. But if you went to a business and they said, well, here's a couple sticks, can you rub them together and make fire? You'd think that was insane. But essentially that's what these high-tech companies are doing. And they have these programmers come in and they're saying, well, there's something that was challenging to do in 1953. And, John Backus or, what's her name? I forget the admiral's name. They figured it out, right? But can you figure it out for us here? Can you make fire out of, these stones or this pair of sticks? That's what they're doing. Why do they do that? Even though it completely conflicts with the super specialists with these job listings that have, 20 requirements. It's not just a preferred. It's you have to have Python 3.11. You have to have C++ 2025 or whatever it is today. All these tools. There's a huge contradiction between so many companies using this purple squirrel excuse, putting out job postings for purple squirrels on the one hand, right? And on the other hand, they're asking people to answer these questions about things they learned in school that are generally not used anymore. It's like asking someone to build a fire from sticks or a piece of flint or something like that. That would be a ridiculous thing to do with any engineer or technician, but in fact we got to that point with computer companies. So let me conclude. I suspect the reason is this is a way of effectively focusing on employing very young, actually quite inexperienced people who work hard, are smart, and motivated. That's actually what they're looking for. For some reason, and I've spoken about this in other videos and written about it, for some reason, they don't like people with a lot of experience. And a lot of experience is like 7 to 10 years of experience. It's not 30 years. It's not some guy in his 80s that they're getting rid of. They're actually getting rid of people, sometimes even in their late 20s. More often it seems to happen around the age of 35, especially people who look 35 and over. Or, if you're lucky or you have plastic surgery and you look like you're 30 and you're actually 40-something and you talk like you're 30 and you kind of act like you are. It doesn't happen as frequently, but it's still there. So what does this mean for you in your job hunt? Well, if you're laid off or you're at risk of being laid off in the current wave, there's a good chance you're actually highly experienced. You're one of these people in your 30s, probably, maybe 40s, that's getting targeted by this strange system. Well, there's an obvious question. If you go spend 2-3 hours in a grueling, exhausting coding interview, and you're 35, and you may have never seen this stuff if you didn't have formal CS training, the reason they're asking you these questions is this is rigged to filter you out anyway. So what can you do? Don't waste your time with those types of interviews. If they're going to do a coding interview, then it should be specifically about what they're hiring you to do, and it should relate to the experience you bring to the table. You don't need to waste your time with a system which is rigged against people with experience. Paradoxically, against people who, quote, know what they're doing, or at least know more, probably significantly more than that 22-year-old or 25-year-old that they are choosing to hire with this method. So take a hard look at investing your time and energy in these coding interviews and interviews where that's a process. You can ask up front and say, what are you going to ask me about? Are you going to ask me about my technical expertise in really the area I'm good at or that I've learned? Or are you going to ask me these kind of questions? Because it may, and I emphasize you have to look at your situation. I don't have any scientific studies or any specifics to say, well, you should just exclude those types of interviews, but you should definitely consider it. You should definitely consider, well, maybe these people are not very likely to hire me, and I'm going to go through this. In some cases, these interview processes take 2 days. Usually you go in for 1 day and then they bring you back another day. And today, a lot of times, almost all of that is these kind of coding interviews, multiple people asking you these questions. Now, you may have prepared, and that's certainly if you can do that. I know people that have done that have gotten jobs, and actually, of course, are not doing what they were interviewed for by the coding interview, right? The coding interview is some weird ritual, perhaps. But really think about it, because actually, it's pretty likely the reason for this particular widespread practice is a way of hiding. They are targeting, basically getting rid of people who are, quote, older, and we're talking people in their 30s often, and getting these young people who are full of energy, they're very healthy, they don't have kids, they don't cost very much for health insurance, they are passionate, right? They love passion, right? You'll work 50, 60, maybe even more hours per week without overtime, right? You're an exempt employee, so you don't get overtime. They give you free food, but, well, that's so you'll stay a couple hours later and put in work that they are, in some sense, paying you, charging somebody $50 to $100 an hour for. So that extra 2 hours, if you have some free food at the end of the day and you stay a couple more hours, they've more than made back the cost of the free food. So in conclusion, many of the coding interview practices really contradict the claims made associated with STEM shortages, particularly the idea of purple squirrels, that we have to have these super specialists in certain hot areas, and that's what they're looking for, right? It doesn't match. That naturally means that if you are pretty experienced in something, you're one of these older, more experienced programmers, it may be really a waste of your time to go through these coding interviews. They really don't want you, and you're just going to put yourself through a draining process, whereas you should be spending your time on the employers that actually want you and are actually interested, which are more likely to, if they do ask technical questions and specifically do coding interviews, it should actually be stuff you know and you're using and that is used in the business. And look at those instead. This concludes this video presentation. If you like this video, please click like. Please click subscribe and the notification bell if you would like to receive more content from us. You can avoid internet censorship by subscribing directly to our RSS news feed. Please consider sharing the link by email and on your website or blog, in addition to liking, upvoting, or sharing on increasingly censored, advertising beholden, big company social media. We have encountered such censorship. Mathematical software is developing algorithms and software to automate data analysis, reducing the risks of costly errors and increasing the predictive power of the results. You can support our work financially by subscribing on our Patreon page, https://www.patreon.com/mathsoft, or scanning the QR code in the lower right corner.